Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to be demonstrating how to paint waves and also be doing a review on M Graham watercolor paints. Along with my M Graham paints, I will also be using a heat tool to help dry my paper quickly. Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay Indie ink in white to help with the seafoam and bringing back the highlights. I will also be using a 3/4 inch flathead paintbrush along with a set number 12 round and a number 8 round. I have a white resist or a clear resist crayon, and I have an old small paintbrush to apply the ink with. Now M Graham paints re-wet beautifully. They are one of my favorite watercolors, and they have a lot of honey in them, and so the paints you see on screen are dry, and so this is just me re-wetting them solely with a wet paintbrush, and they re-wet so nicely because of all that honey. It just helps it reactivate quickly. M Graham paints also flow really nicely. You can see with this wet into wet demonstration that they just bloom out. For this demonstration right here, I am using Strathmore 400 watercolor paper, so not super fancy watercolor paper, and yet the paints still flow really nicely. They also blend into each other really well, as you can see with me kind of doing this rainbow gradient. I love M Graham paints. They are probably my most used watercolor paints, along with the Hydrus color watercolors. But these are more traditional. They come in large tubes. They are pretty inexpensive for professional grade watercolors. If you are in the States, they are made in, I believe, Oregon, and they are just fantastic. They're super pigmented, they layer really nicely. They also have the ability to lift. So Hydrus watercolors are very staining, which I like to use that for the type of painting I do with the Hydrus colors, but I love how these ones lift, and I can create more traditional paintings with it. Now you see me using the clear wax crayon, and I am putting that on the paper wherever I want to help preserve some of the white of the paper. You can see I've done a basic outline of where I have the horizon line and the waves, and I'm just putting the crayon wherever I want to preserve that. Now you see me using my flat brush to wet the paper. This is supposed to be clean water, clean clear water, but apparently I didn't rinse out my brush all the way. But I'm wetting the paper so I can do wet into wet painting to help create soft blooms, so I can create a soft look in the sky. It helps the sky look more soft, and I'm leaving some bits of the sky white to represent the clouds. And when that was dry, I used my heat tool to dry that. But when that was dry, I started wetting the bottom half of the paper so that I can do the water. You don't want to try to do the water when the sky's still wet, else the paint will wick up into your sky. Now I'm starting to brush in some ultramarine blue along the horizon line. The sky was done with cerulean blue and a little bit of cobalt blue. And so now I'm just getting that ultramarine blue and a little bit of Prussian blue. And you can just see that blooming down. My board is on a slight angle to help keep the paint moving down, and that way I have better control of how I lay down pigments. So you can see I've added ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, and a little bit of phthalo blue and cobalt blue. I am using all of my blues that I have in M Graham paints for this painting, and it's really fun to be able to really utilize your colors, and because you don't usually use all your blues in one painting, and so it's really fun to do that. Now you can see this light green color. That is a mix of traditional phthalo green and phthalo green yellow shade. And I've diluted that down and thinned it down and kind of created different mixes with it. And I'm using that in the part of the wave that comes up. And it will help represent the light shining through the water. Now remember, with your phthalo colors, those are very staining, and so you want to make sure your paper's wet and you know exactly where you want to put it. Now you saw a moment ago I added some brown. That's a mixture of burnt sienna, burnt umber, and some of the blues to kind of neutralize it, mostly ultramarine blue. and I just put that down to help represent the sand. And then I did another layer of wax resist over the top to prevent some of these bottom layers that are lighter before I go over the top with more paint. I like working in thin layers of color. That way I can really have more control over how it looks. And especially when I'm using really staining colors like the phthalo colors, I have a lot of control over how dark it gets. So you can see I kind of blotted it out. That is because I wanted the color to not be quite as dark. So I just blotted it a little bit, and I'm really looking at my reference photo to kind of see where all the shadows are and the details are in this wave, and I'm starting to block in those areas. If you would like to follow along with this painting, you can look in the description box below and you will see a link to my blog post about it. And in my blog post I will have the reference photo available so that you can more easily follow along. Now on this above view you can see a little bit of my mixing palette, and you can see that I have all different shades of blues and greens available to work with, and I'm just layering those up and just continuing looking at my reference photos. I'm trying, even with the wax crayon, I'm still trying to protect some of the light areas of the paper, just to help make it easier as I go along. This video is sped up about twice as fast, and so don't get discouraged if you can't paint this fast, because this is definitely sped up. I tried to keep it a little bit slower this time since it was a smaller painting and I was able to do it more quickly, so that you could see more of what my brush is doing. And I'm just kind of going back and looking at my reference photos and comparing my picture to there, looking at what areas need to be a little bit darker, and just continually going back and forth. I really like layering up my paints and working in thin layers. Now you see I picked up a little bit of cobalt teal, and I'm adding that. I wanted it to have a little bit more of a teal tone. I really like the cobalt teal. You can also create a lovely teal color mixing phthalo blue and regular phthalo green together. That creates a really nice teal. And you can thin it out with water, so you could control how light and dark it is. Now I'm starting to darken some of the browns, because the sand will be a little bit darker because in this area of the painting it is wet, and so it will appear a little bit darker, maybe have a little bit more of a blue undertone to it. And so I'm just starting to build up those brown layers. Since the water is transparent, you can see a little bit under the water, so I added some of that. Now M Graham paints are available in individual tubes, and they are also available in small sets. They've created really fun sets. I really like the quinacridone set, but they also have some other ones where you get more of a mix of colors. Now you can see I've rewet the sky, and I am starting to darken it up. As I did the ocean, I realized that my sky was too light, and so I am just going in very carefully with some more cobalt and cerulean to help darken it up. So I'm doing more cobalt at the top and then more cerulean at the bottom, and I'm just blending that really softly and just making sure to keep some of the areas lighter to represent the clouds. So now that I've got some pigment down, I'm going to take a rag and kind of dab up some of the paint that I've laid down, and that's to kind of bring back some of the white of the paper. This is part of the reason why I did not use any phthalo colors in the sky, because they are so staining I wouldn't be able to dab up and create kind of this white fluffy cloud texture. So that's something to keep in mind when you are painting, is looking at how staining the colors you are using and where you want to put them. Now, you haven't really seen me use my heat tool in this video, and that's because I've edited most of it out. Um, that way I can show more of the actual painting process and not have this video be 2 hours long. But I really like using the heat tool to help speed things up if I'm not trying to create super soft blends. So I dried up the sky, and I'm back into adding more layers into the water. Now, M Graham paints can dry a little bit lighter than what they appear when you put them down, and that's pretty typical of most watercolors. So just keep that in mind that it will dry lighter. Part of the reason I like working in light layers like this is that I can go back and color correct really easily, and I don't have to worry about picking up a lot of layers that are underneath it. Now the process of layering your pigments, so doing a layer, letting it dry, and then putting another lighter layer of paint over it so that you can see the bottom ones through it, is called glazing. And that's where you're really playing off these bottom layers, and you don't want to cover them completely. You still want some of it to peek through, but you're really deepening the color, and you're really deepening the texture and the design in this. And M Graham paints glaze really well. I like how you can even glaze uh, the granulating colors, which can tend to be a little bit more difficult to glaze. And so that's also something that's really nice, is that you can layer them up pretty easily. For this piece, I am working on Arches paper, and so that also influences it. The type of watercolor paper you're working on makes a huge difference on how your painting comes out and how your paints work. And so Arches paper really allows me to layer up these M Graham paints really nicely. Now, to help this wave get a lot of dimension and shape, I'm making sure to add my dark shadows. Having a lot of contrast in your picture, having your darks dark enough and your lights light enough, will really help create dimension in your painting. And so as you can see, me adding that shadow to the waves and into the distant water is really helping give this picture shape. So just keep that in mind. For the shadows on the wave portion, I'm using a lot of phthalo blue and phthalo greens and a little bit of Prussian blue, and I'm using that in slightly more concentrated form to create those shadows. In the distance, I'm keeping it more of the ultramarine blue and a little bit of Prussian blue. Now I'm adding another layer of the wax resist to kind of help protect these lighter layers as I go along. When you're using the wax and a heat tool, it's best to let it air dry. That way the wax doesn't bleed too much and it is more effective. But if you are going to use your heat tool, just keep in mind that your bottom layers of wax may not resist the paint as well, because they will absorb into the paper instead of staying on top. Now you can see I'm really keeping my my strokes very horizontal. Um, they're going right along with the horizon line, except for the portion of the painting where the wave is coming up. That one I kept my strokes more vertical, and this is really important because it helps the direction we put our paint on really affects how it looks visually on the paper. So I keep my sky strokes and my water strokes very horizontal. I don't want to be going up and down because I want them to look nice and smooth. And that allows that wave and the strokes I'm doing that are kind of curved to show that wave coming up and curling over. Now you can see I have my flat paintbrush, and I am gently pulling the paint horizontal and helping blend it. The paintbrush is damp. It is not soaking wet. It's just slightly damp to help pull some of the pigments. This is part of the reason why I'm not using a ton of staining colors. That way I can still manipulate the paint as I go along. Now the gray handled paintbrushes I'm using are Mimic squirrel hair paintbrushes, and they are from Creative Mark, and they are really nice. They hold a nice point and they hold a lot of water, and so it really allows me to work for a long period of time without having to continually dip my brush in and out of the paint. Now you can see I'm using my white Indian ink, and I am starting to brighten up some of the foam that forms in the ocean water. And so I'm kind of showing that. I'm flicking it on the tip of my finger to kind of get some of these splatters. And I'm just layering this up. Sorry, my hand gets in the way a little bit, but I'm just layering this up, and I will go back in and do more watercolor, and then I'll go back and do more ink, and I'm just kind of this back and forth um, layering to get the desired effect I want. Now for the ink, I am just applying that using a golden Taklon brush, just a small one. And I use that kind of brush with the ink because ink can be really hard on your watercolor brushes. And so I try to avoid using ink with my watercolor brushes. That way I don't have to worry about the ink drying in the bristles and ruining my watercolor brushes. Now I'm going in with my dagger brush, and this is kind of an angled brush. This is a Princeton Neptune one, and I'm using it to go in and do fine details on the painting. I'm really showing the kind of striations in the water from the light. This angled dagger brush is fantastic. It's one of the most useful paintbrushes I have. I usually use round brushes, but this one I can do such fine detail with and create really organic, unusual shapes. So it's great for things like the texture that you can see in the water, branches on trees or the leaves, grasses. It's a really, really useful brush. You can create thin and thick lines with it, and I just absolutely love using this brush. So now I'm going in with a little bit more of cobalt blue and just kind of tying that in. As we go along right now, I'm going to be kind of tying in some of the colors you see in the distance, like more of the blues that have kind of purpley undertones, and pulling some of those more forward. I'm also kind of reestablishing that horizon line, making sure it's nice and straight. Especially with water, you want to make sure that horizon line is very, very straight because it will be very noticeable. You're not supposed to have hills in the middle of the ocean. So now we are on the final stretch of finishing up this painting. It's about 90% done, and we are just going in and doing the final details. This is where I recommend you take your time. You know, you've been working on it for a while, so maybe go and get a drink of water or eat some lunch, but just kind of take a little bit of a break, and then you can come back and see what needs to be worked on. And when I took a break, I realized I wanted a little bit more colored variance in the picture, so it wasn't quite so flat. So I added a little bit of dioxazine purple to my water. I kept it a little bit more dark and concentrated along the horizon line, and now I'm adding little bits of it to the waves to where I want some shadows or some um, texture on the water. And I really, really feel like this helped pull the picture together. It added some more interest so it wasn't too monochromatic. And remember, this looks like I'm doing this all really, really fast, but this is a sped up version and an edited version. And so this painting took me about an hour and a half of just painting time. That's not counting drying time. And so just remember to take your time. You're not in a hurry, and you can just enjoy this process. So now I'm going back in with my white ink and adding some more detail, kind of redefining where I want the waves to be. This time to have a little bit more control of the direction the white ink is splattering, I am using just a little piece of cardboard to help me angle how it flicks. That way it can, the foam splattering that I'm trying to create is fits the direction the wave is going. So to kind of discuss a little bit more about the M Graham paints as I continue to reinforce the highlights of the foam in the painting, I have about 40-ish M Graham paints, and I have really enjoyed all of them. Some of my favorites include nickel quinacridone, azo green, Prussian blue, phthalo blue, cobalt teal, their quinacridone rose, and quin red are beautiful colors as well, and I just really, really have loved these paints. They are my go-to paints when I want to create more traditional watercolor paintings. So you can see I've been reinforcing my highlights on this paper and really making that water look nice and foamy and look like that wave is about to curl in. And this is one of my favorite parts of the painting process, when you can see it all start to tie together. Now I'm starting to add a little bit of shadows to those highlights that I did, and that will really help those waves really stand out more. It will allow that foam to kind of pop against your highlights. If you find that your whites aren't bright enough, that you're having a hard time getting those highlights in your picture, that means that your darks, especially the ones next to it, aren't quite dark enough, and you need to darken the stuff around it, and that will help your highlights pop a little bit more. So you can see I'm doing a little bit of that, and just kind of fine-tuning this painting, adding some shadows to the top of the wave, and helping create the shape that I want. Now, don't forget, I have other watercolor tutorials and speed paintings, and I also have reviewed other brands of watercolors, and so I will leave a link to that playlist up in the corner. And if you want more information about this painting, a full list of the colors and the tools I used, and links to where I get them, look in the description box below, and that will link you up to my blog post where I talk about it. Now, one thing I've failed to mention as we've been going along this tutorial is that I actually have two things of water. I have two mason jars, one's a little bit bigger, and I have one for my dirty water and one for my clean water. So oftentimes I will rinse off my dirty paintbrush in the dirty water quick, and then rinse it off in the clean water. And that helps me always have clean water available to me as I paint, so I don't have to stop and get new water all of the time. Now, don't forget that just because this is a review of M Graham paints, that you have to use M Graham paints or even all the colors listed to follow along with this tutorial. Use what paints you have, whatever brand they are, and also make the most of the colors. You can mix your blues with greens or um, purples and pinks to create your own colors and your own variants of blue. So you don't have to use as many. I used a lot of different colors just to kind of show off the M Graham paints and what they can do, but you use what you have available and get used to them. Here is a close-up of the picture. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you found it useful, please hit the like and subscribe button and the notification bell so you can see my next watercolor tutorials when they come available. Thank you so much. Have a great day.